The warehouse stretched forever in every direction, sterile white walls yawning toward eternity. In the center of it, they were impossibly tiny, yet they were everything. Her memory of the scene played out again. Mrs. Smythe having both of them trapped, trying to turn them against each other. In real life, she had fought back. John had helped her and trusted her even at her worst, and they had escaped. But this time, instead of using an injection to cause him pain, Mrs. Smythe began removing her clothes. She cast Lizzie a mocking smile and then slid into John's lap, pressing herself against his chest. He struggled, but he was bound too tightly to do anything as... Lizzie tore out of the dream and found herself bolt upright in bed. She had snagged her knife from its place and held it in front of her, gleaming in the moonlight. It took her a moment to come back to herself, to realize that it had been a dream. John was lying beside her, coming awake as he realized how upset she was. There was no fear in his eyes, but she could see the deep concern there. "Lizzie, are you all right?" "I'm fine, John, just a bad dream." She gave him a beaming smile and set the knife aside casually, but her acting wasn't good enough. There were still those lines of concern on his face. It was wonderful that he'd come to know her better and better, but that meant she couldn't keep herself from being a burden to him. It can be hard to shake those off. Come here and rest, Lizzie. Though she wanted to pretend that everything was alright, she couldn't resist his soothing voice. Lizzie curled up next to him, resting her head on his chest. It did feel wonderful, pushing aside the remnants of the dream, but this wasn't how it was supposed to be. She was supposed to protect him. John was the one who was so sad, who needed to be protected from the world. He carried so much weight. She couldn't add anything to it. Lizzie bit her lip and squeezed him tighter, wishing she could be perfect. "I'm sorry, John." "Don't say that. I'm glad that I can be here for you." "You always are. Come here and try to relax." She snuggled against him, much of her anxiety fading. But what if one day he wasn't there? What if someone took him from her? She would bathe the world in blood, and it would do no good because he would be gone, and she would have nothing. Lizzie slowly managed to let go of other thoughts and just enjoy his presence, but it took her a very long time to go to sleep. The lecture rolled onward, flowing around the edges of Lizzie's mind. She is absorbing some of the information, but her thoughts were mostly elsewhere. On the page in front of her increasingly, she'd taken a back corner seat on so that it would look like she was dutifully taking notes, but in fact, she was pouring out her thoughts onto the pages of her spiral notebook. Lizzie paused a moment, looking over what she had written recently. It was chaotic, but a familiar chaos. His name over and over again in increasingly scratchy letters. Wild fragments of thoughts connecting conspiracies. Lists of women who had gotten close to him. Too close to him. She wondered what would John think if he read this, and decided it would be better not to burden him. Thinking of him always made her smile, but Lizzie also stopped to consider John as analytically as she could. Her mind ran over the roll of images she held of his face, all the smallest changes in his eyes. She was doing better than usual, she realized, though his smile was sometimes melancholy. It felt appropriate for him, and she didn't see any other signs of depression. There were no shadows in his eyes, and he had been very affectionate last night. That thought made Lizzie squirm a little in her seat, molten lava dripping from her mind all through her body and pooling deep inside her core. She let herself dwell on that shared moment for a long time. Pulling herself out of her thoughts, Lizzie set aside the notebook and returned to her real notes. She didn't need to take many, quickly jotting down the key points to catch up to the speaker. Once she was done, her mind began to wander again. It seemed that the event planning had gone through. Their local campus activist group had petitioned the right places, and now Kelsey was going to be speaking in town. That was a good thing, theoretically. It would disturb Koitek, and it would make John happy. Lizzie had read some of her articles to try to vet her, and Francisca seemed intelligent. Her visit would probably give them nice things to talk about. She was married too, and had been for 6 years. Everything was fine, so Lizzie didn't object to them getting a little involved in helping to set up the event. Everything was fine. Lizzie absentmindedly realized that she was gripping her pen tightly and stabbing it repeatedly into the side of her notebook, leaving it covered in gouges. After class, Lizzie headed out and started to walk her usual path before she remembered that things had changed. Frowning slightly, she changed her route to head to the administration building instead, where she would be meeting with John. Others would be there as well. The exact purpose of the event was unclear to her. At a minimum, they would gather and receive information about the various activities they would be doing in preparation for the visit and speech. Presumably, after that, they would go and do said activities, and she could be alone with him. Except that he had expressed interest, which was reasonable. Perhaps they would participate. He had noticed her anxiousness, however, and not committed to anything beforehand. That was very considerate of him, but Lizzie made a vow to do a better job of supporting him. As she entered the building, she saw that a crowd of people had gathered. It appeared to be an ordinary enough college group, likely not a concern, though it was more difficult to evaluate threats in a crowd such as this. She searched through the random people in the way, but was unable to find John. Realizing that she was going to be engaged, Lizzie refocused on Aaron, who was coming to greet her. Aaron and two women, young, attractive women their age, wearing clothes that were stylish and extremely suggestive. Not physical threats, but potentially. Lizzie gave them all a brittle smile. "Hey Lizzie, good to see you here." "Hello." "We're just getting organized, but there are a ton of things we need to do. We already printed a bunch of flyers to put up, but we actually got space on one of the big boards, so we need some people to help design a poster, and we also..." "Where's John?" "Over in the corner. We're going to organize after the..." "Thank you." Lizzie left them, though she watched Aaron and the others for a moment longer. Aaron seemed to have noticed she wasn't completely happy, which was a problem. Being herself around John had made her sloppy, though Aaron might also be more perceptive than average. She headed through the crowd searching for John. Part of her knew that the people here were probably decent given their interest. No, too many of them were just looking for socialization, or a cause that made them feel good about themselves. There were too many of them to judge, and some could possibly be threats. "We'll find John." Though many options presented themselves to her, Lizzie decided to take the simplest. Best to be prepared and not do anything that might disturb John. That left her feeling a little more confident in herself, but Lizzie still searched for his voice in the crowd and focused on him. There he was. Lizzie restrained herself as she simply skipped up to him, taking his arm like any normal girlfriend would do. Her fingers dug into his arm, harder than she'd intended, as he gave her a look with a hint of concern. "Hello, Lizzie." "Sorry I'm late." She beamed at John to reassure him that everything was alright, then also beamed at the nearby people. Not likely any threats, but she beamed hard at them anyway. "I was actually just finished organizing all the different tasks. Aaron is better at drawing people together than organizing the details, you know." "That's so true." Some girl laughed unnecessarily loudly at his observation, prompting Lizzie's full attention to zero in on her. Slight pupil dilation, no visible flushing, heart rate slightly above average. Was that flirting? Was she trying to steal him away from her? But we haven't assigned any tasks yet. What do you think, Lizzie? Do you want help, or do we have too much to do at home? It was an obvious lifeline to her if she was too stressed, but Lizzie loved him for it. Of course she could trust her John. He would always be true to her. "You might have to go? We need all the help we can get." The girl's gaze turned away from John, too deliberately. A ruse? And toward Lizzie. She gave a smile that touched the corners of her eyes, indicating that it was authentic. But though Lizzie automatically mirrored it, she felt only a cold hollowness. "I was actually hoping you could help us put up flyers. I've seen you around campus. You're super fast." What game did she have in mind with such flattery? Lizzie failed to see the adventures the girl gained, but she disliked the situation all the same. Still, there were a wide variety of different tasks available, and not all of them would leave John vulnerable. She had delayed too long in answering, leaving an uncomfortable pause. It had been a very long time since her social skills had failed her like that. Worse, it was causing him stress, which was unacceptable. Lizzie pretended to be looking over the organizational sheet to buy herself a little time. "It's up to you, Lizzie, but I noticed that we need a couple people to move cabinets and desk out of the supply room that we're going to use. Think we could do that?" Lizzie smiled as she realized that he was offering her a chance. Though John was always considerate when he was feeling less depressed, he was especially attentive to her concerns. The idea of participating wasn't unpleasant, but it would be so much calmer and more wonderful alone at home. Lizzie looked up, smiled, and made her decision. "We'll take his idea." "Your idea sounded fun, John. Let's do that." "Seriously? That stuff is heavy. You're going to end up making him do all the work." "I can provide moral support." The girl rolled her eyes at them, but didn't try to interfere any further. After signing up and getting the appropriate key, that left Lizzie and John to head to the supply room he referenced. In the old art building, they headed down one of the lesser-used hallways, her arm still linked with his. Being alone together in a place like this brought lovely ideas to mind, but since they were helping a cause that mattered to him, Lizzie restrained herself. Before too long, they reached the room, which John unlocked. The room inside was reasonably large, but filled with years of ancient desks, cabinets, and other furniture, not to mention a host of random boxes. Nobody wanted this job because the old cabinets are ridiculously heavy. I'm guessing that won't be a problem, though. Lizzie stepped over to one of them and pressed her hand against the side, tipping it experimentally. The metal groaned and dust fell from the cabinet, but it didn't feel particularly heavy. There's nobody watching, right? People don't usually come here. We're only using it because most of the real meeting rooms are booked that night. Then I'll take care of it, no problem. They have a recycling guy coming for the metal, so we just need to take them out back. Nodding, Lizzie moved to the cabinet that was the most in the way of the others and picked it up without difficulty. A box that had been set on top of it tilted to the side, and John snagged it before it could fall. Smiling thanks at him, Lizzie carried the cabinet out the door he had referenced and left it at the edge of the back lot. Being made of metal was indeed heavier than average, but not really a challenge for her strength. They soon found a good rhythm working together, which made Lizzie glow inside. She handled all the heaviest furniture while John organized the rest and cleared off boxes and other materials that would get in her way. Her strength hadn't been something that she'd ever given much thought when she was growing up. First, something to be hidden to avoid attention, then an advantage to be cultivated. It had never been something that brought her any joy. That had changed the day she saved him from falling. Since then, she'd realized that she could use it to protect him. There had really only been a few brief moments when she had used her strength to its full potential, but she was just as happy for simple things like this as well. The two of them working to move so many things. It reminded her when they moved into their apartment together, and that made her imagine them moving into an actual home of her own, which was a wonderful thought. She would be overjoyed for that, no matter the circumstances, but it would be most wonderful if it happened after they were married. The tradition seemed meaningless to her in isolation, but the idea of doing it with John. Such thoughts carried Lizzie happily through the rest of their work, made her frequently smile over at John, and he smiled back, seeming much lighter than she had seen him for recent days. Lizzie didn't even mind that they were preparing for Francesca to speak. Working toward it together with him, it didn't seem like such a bad thing after all. John, can you help me with these? The desks are too long for one person to carry. Not without damaging something. Oh, so that's why you've been skipping them. Sure, I'll try. He acted as though he might not be able to help, but of course he came to assist her. And really, it really was true that she needed his help. She wouldn't have wanted him to feel condescended to. As strong as she was, there was just no good way to carry a desk alone. Between the two of them, it was no trouble at all to move the desks and finish clearing the room. Plus, she got to watch him on the other side of the desk. He was used to her gaze and didn't mind it, though he needed to focus on their path more than she did to avoid running into things. When at last they finished, the room was still dusty and stuffy, but at least it was empty. More time had passed than she had expected. John didn't seem as surprised, but she was glad to see the slight smile on his face. It's not much, but we did our part to help. It wasn't a problem for you, was it? Not at all, John. Thanks for thinking of this. Having said that, I'm definitely ready to head home. Me too. Though they were both a little dusty, Lizzie didn't hesitate to link her arm with his and lean against him as they walked home. Getting cleaned up together might be fun. When her schedule went unusually well, Lizzie found herself acting somewhat troubled. She had no reading for classes, the shopping had gone quickly, and nothing had slowed her down. That meant that she had a surprising amount of extra time. On one night, John needed to work late at the library. For a little while, she busied herself tidying up the house and cleaning her knives, but she found herself anxious. It was no serious premonition, just an uncomfortable feeling. She was glad to have him in her mind, and she was sure she would soon find his song again. But she also wanted him in the flesh. She spent a while writing in her notebook, many of his pages now heavy with ink. Mostly plans for worst-case scenarios. Something happened during Francesca's visit, and she needed to protect John. But that couldn't hold her attention for long. This was a bad night to be home alone. After chewing on one knuckle for a while, Lizzie decided that she'd go visit John at the library. She padded across campus, knowing how different it was at night. The normal dorms were still bright and would become progressively louder as the students started to party. A few were ambling further, likely drunk or stoned. They had been invited a time or two, but for the most part she and John didn't have connections to those crowds, Being together and off campus, even just slightly off campus, set them apart from the other students. Normally, Lizzie never gave the subject a second thought. Now she found herself resenting her happiness. All of them wasting their time so carelessly while he was working, alone, and probably depressed. If she urged him to take fewer shifts, he would. Lizzie knew that. But as much as she wanted more of him, she didn't want to unfairly force him to do that. If John thought the extra work was necessary, then he was probably right. Still, Lizzie's eyes briefly flickered to a couple sprawled over one another in the grass. Neither a threat. They were pulling at their clothes, though, and well past the point of just making out. Before they finished college, she wanted a moment like that. Not doing something like that in public, but simply being together by the trees, enjoying themselves. College should be a time of happy memories. Light years between the drama of their meeting and the difficulties of adulthood. She wanted something she could remember forever. Maybe capture in a picture. Yet right now everything was so complicated. Lizzie frowned and looked away, increasing her pace. It wasn't fair. The library itself was basically deserted since few were doing research on a Friday night. That was why John ended up with a long shift, and why he took it, being paid to do his own work. Lizzie found herself shifting to walk silently instead of giving any sign of her presence. This could be a good opportunity to observe him without him being aware. It had been the first way that she had come to love him, and though the other ways since coming to know him were better, watching still held a special place in her heart. She peered around a bookshelf and finally spotted him. John sat behind the desk, reading from one of his books. He was making decent progress, brow furrowed in that concentrated look that she so loved. But occasionally his focus seemed to waver. She noticed his eyes grew a little distant and he had to backtrack on the page. Sometimes when he did, he would look at a sheet of paper beside him for a while, occasionally making a note. Were they just his notes? But she knew John's note-taking habits extremely well, and that wasn't how he usually operated. It was as if he was trying to read, but simultaneously distracted by thoughts of something else. What could it possibly be? Her mind imagined that it was some kind of love letter, but she discarded that possibility as quickly as she could. No, John wouldn't do that. If he wrote a love letter, it would be to her. He looked so sad, though. Lizzie stared as her gaze could strip away his skull and reveal every thought inside. If she just understood him perfectly, she could prevent him from being sad. There would be no anxiety then. Only perfect trust for one another. Lizzie retreated further in the library just in case he looked up in her direction and watched him from a vantage point even he wouldn't notice. He did glance up a few times, almost as if he felt her watching, but she was too well hidden. It was wonderful that he could almost sense her, but Lizzie needed to watch him for now. Eventually she would understand. Hours passed in a flash and suddenly John was standing and yawning. After so long of his stillness, it was almost startling. Apparently his shift was almost over, which meant he would need to lock up. Deciding that she had watched enough, Lizzie sneaked through the back stacks and approached him near the entrance again, beaming. John smiled the instant he saw her. Lizzie, I hope you weren't lonely. I just wanted to come and greet you once your shift was over. You're a sight for sore eyes after this dead shift. Just give me a moment to lock up. It didn't take him long, and then they were walking across campus to head back home, her arm through his and her head leaning against his shoulder. They passed the couple, now lying still on top of one another. John seemed a little surprised, but just shook his head. Lizzie inclined her head toward them, then looked back at him and raised her eyebrows. Sorry, I can barely keep my eyes open. That's okay, I know you've studied hard. Let me help you rest. When they got home, she quickly took his bag from him and put it away before he could go to the trouble. If she acted quickly enough, he wouldn't need to use any more energy to make decisions and could just relax. Eventually, he fell asleep with his head on her lap, finally looking truly at peace. Lizzie stroked his hair and stared down at him, watching. Life proceeded normally enough. A significant part of campus was busy preparing for the arrival. But there were more people who didn't know or didn't care. But it mattered to John, so it mattered to Lizzie. Since their time together clearing out the room had gone well, they'd kept participating together. Hadn't all been as much fun as that, but Lizzie didn't mind the time preparing, and John seemed positively engaged by all of it. But when she came home from class one day, she realized that she might have gotten it entirely wrong. John slumped on the couch, too unfocused to notice her. There was an emptiness in his eyes that she hadn't seen in some time, immediately making her heart hammer in her chest. John, are you okay? Is something wrong? I'm just a little tired. There's not a problem or anything. Of course there's a problem if you're not feeling okay. You don't have to pretend to smile for me, John. It's okay to be sad sometimes. Thank you, Lizzie. It's nothing specific. I'm just having a bad day. Then stay right there and don't worry about anything. She skipped closer and gave him a quick hug and kiss, but didn't try to press. Instead, she moved on into the kitchen, getting something simmering. When John was depressed, he didn't want to eat. She had learned that trying to force it could turn bad, but the smell would slowly get through to him. While doing her work, Lizzie headed into their bathroom and counted his depression medication. Didn't seem like he had forgotten or that he had taken more than usual, which was good. But though his medication helped, it couldn't make his life perfect. There had been a time when she had desperately hoped that she could do that. She still wished that she could, but she knew that his sadness didn't mean that he didn't love her. All she could do was be supportive. When she came back out, he had slumped back further, but she saw a bit more relaxation in his posture. Suddenly her heart ached with love for him, so intense that she had to support herself at the doorframe. She didn't deserve him. He was always so supportive, so kind, even when it cost him. It was easy to just bask in his presence, to see him as a shining paragon. But her John was human, had limited resources, if she had missed the signs as she sometimes did. One of Lizzie's fingers slid up to her mouth, and she started to bite down on it, but she pulled back. John wouldn't want her to do that. Instead, she moved into the room, determined to give back this time. She checked on the soup, then went to sit beside him, just touching his side a little, being present without demanding anything of him. John smiled at her but didn't say anything. It was a quiet smile that faded into sadness, but she loved it too. These incidents always magnified her love for him. She didn't love his depression, but when he was like this, he seemed so truly real that she couldn't take her eyes off him. Lizzie restrained herself and just sat supportively. After a time, though, she shifted. Later on, maybe they could eat, but until then... Do you need to talk about anything? I'll be okay. I think I just overexerted myself preparing for Kelsey's visit. Oh, I haven't been pushing you too much, have I? It was so much fun when we worked together before, so... No, I don't mean that at all. There's just so much to do. I know you want to help, but you know your limits, right? You can't help others if you're not okay. You're right. Thanks, Lizzie. Lizzie thought that their conversation had gone well, but she was plagued by doubt. She hadn't noticed the depression incoming, hadn't been able to prevent it. She had been going over every interaction in minute detail, wondering where she had neglected something. Lizzie realized that she needed to get out of her head. If she let herself keep thinking that way, she would end up spending the evening developing elaborate plans to kill someone, or kidnap John to safety. She needed to do something, but what? Lizzie wanted to be supportive, but she knew she couldn't help him if she let herself grow unstable. So she hesitantly began to talk, letting him know about her insecurities. Though John didn't have much energy to spare, he did his best to listen. But as things went on, Lizzie began to tell that he was growing more depressed. She wished she'd decided differently, but it was too late. They stopped talking after a while and just held each other on the couch, drifting closer to sleep as exhaustion claimed them. As she fell asleep, Lizzie settled on another thought. This visit might be a good thing, but she'd be very glad when it was over. When the day finally came, it wasn't as grand as all the build-up Lizzie had led Lizzie to expect. It was just another speaker coming to campus after all. And as one of the better universities in the region, they got plenty of speakers. The growing power of pharmaceuticals was a somewhat hot topic, but it was hardly a source of celebrity. Her expectations had been tempered by John's attitude, though. Aaron and some of the other organizers were exhilarated as if a visit from a guest speaker would change everything. But, as usual, he was more reserved. It was one of the things that made his love for her so special, and she loved it as part of him. The low-key nature of the entire thing did a lot to calm her anxiety, though Lizzie had filled many pages of her notebook with plans in the event of an attack. But given that this was one stop on a long speaking tour, it seemed less likely that Koitek would actually try anything. They were headed out to attend soon, and although it was going to be as casual as most events on campus, Lizzie had dressed up a little out of habit. She lingered by the cabinet, trying to select which weapons to take along with her. The problem was that she had room for so few. Her axe, of course, but the knives were always a problem. Ready to go, Lizzie? Almost, John. Let me just pick a knife and I'll be with you. He leaned against the nearby wall, watching her thoughtfully as she chose. After a moment, he spoke slowly. I'm just wondering, would you be happy if Kelsey managed to destroy Koitek somehow? Of course. It's a terrible company. It gave you that awful drug and it tried to take us apart. But she isn't going to destroy it, just regulate it. Maybe things will get better, but I want revenge. I meant destroy in a metaphorical sense, dismantling the corporation. You're more thinking leveling it to the ground. Blood and flames. Lizzie answered happily and finally picked a slender knife. Good balance of range, heavy enough to be durable, but thin enough to augment her axe with stabbing potential. She set it into its place and turned to him. But I don't mind things like this. Anything that works against them is good, and though I don't want you to hurt yourself, I'm happy that you care about this so much. But if there is some way to leave them intact but ensure they never bothered us again, I'd take it, of course. You're the most important thing. She leaned forward to give him a kiss, letting this one linger. It might be their last until the serious event was over, so she wanted to enjoy it. Not that she minded waiting. It made the next kiss when they came together all the sweeter. I just wanted to say that you're the most important thing to me, too. Sorry if I seem preoccupied by all this. No, it's fine. I'd like to see you focus on things you love. Well, I don't take you for granted. I hope I never do. John, if you keep talking like that, we won't make it to the event. He chuckled and offered her his arm, which she gratefully accepted. They headed out to the hall to hear the speech. They arrived and found the hall surprisingly full, almost enough to make her wish they'd arrived earlier, but it would be fine. Aaron waved to them from near the front, but those seats were already full, so they took ones near the back. It's good to see our work wasn't wasted. At least, lots of people seem interested. Lots of people from the community, too. Doesn't surprise me. Koitek may not have any direct presence here, but they manufacture so many drugs, people have to know about them. Lizzie reached out to hold his hand while they waited for things to get started. He took it and chatted casually with her until it was finally time. After some awkward testing at the mic and a squeal of feedback, the dean managed to quiet people down. Though he gave an introduction to Francesca Kelsey, Lizzie wasn't able to focus on it. She already knew the information and it was essentially just a formality anyway. More importantly, Lizzie looked for the woman herself and found her seated near the front. She looked like her pictures. Nothing out of the ordinary, but Lizzie shifted her gaze between her and the exits, just to be sure. When Francesca Kelsey took the stage, Lizzie surreptitiously shot a glance at John. But she had been wrong to worry. He had shifted to his purely focused mode, interested only in what she had to say. On my first day of work at the FDCA, my supervisor said I should look for another job because the organization wouldn't be needed for long. She was a good speaker, though her speech had the feeling of one that had been repeated a huge number of times. It had an air of authenticity, but it was a practiced authenticity. Lizzie could only focus on it in the background anyway. While listening idly, Lizzie came to a realization. Something she had never said to John. Probably something she should discuss with him. She squirmed a little in her seat, wondering what thoughts he might have about it, but she couldn't interrupt. Some people might have said that Koitek created her with her ill-advised experiment when Abby was pregnant. Lizzie had never felt that way. Until now, Lizzie had never felt that way. Until now, had not reflected on the fact. Now she understood why. The experiment might have made her different from other girls, but Lizzie didn't care about that. What mattered to her was the person she was now, shaped by her years of growing up, and most importantly, shaped by John. Her world had felt so hollow and empty, and then when she had found him, she had been monomaniacal in her focus on him, but he had opened up a new world of possibilities for her. Unable to contain herself, Lizzie leaned over and kissed John on the cheek. He blinked in surprise and then smiled at her. Resting her head against his shoulder, Lizzie let her focus drift back to the speech for a moment. The industry's lobbyists would have you believe that their self-regulation has been and will continue to be effective. The primary example that is always brought up is how thalidomide was kept out of the United States, and so many children were spared birth defects. But as I demonstrate thoroughly in my book, this was more of a quirk of fate than self-regulation, and that thin layer of defense will not be remotely adequate given the massive increase in research and development we've seen over the past 2 decades. Most notably, many of the newest drugs that are being produced treat conditions that are fundamentally subjective. Their consequences, if any, will take years to emerge, and may not always be as clearly defined as birth defects. Make no mistake, there are people alive today bearing the scars of this unchecked research. Sooner or later, they will come forward. Lizzie sat tensely, deciding to hold in her concerns over that development, but John had already considered that. He squeezed her hand and bent over closer to whisper to her. Are you all right? John, would you want me to step forward and do that? No. His answer came immediately. Lizzie was a little surprised, and John seemed to have taken himself aback, but a moment later he smiled. No. You matter more to me than all of this. Anyone who stepped forward would be surrounded by a horrible amount of controversy. I want you here with me. Her smile widened, and Lizzie leaned in to kiss him, tears in her eyes. She had so many things she wanted to say to him, but some people around them were already glaring at their whispering. When the two of them kissed, most of the glances rolled their eyes and turned away. The speech ended with Francesca's usual conclusion. The FDCA was toothless compared to the pharmaceutical giants, and the world needed a far more comprehensive set of regulations. Part of Lizzie's mind acknowledged that as true, but it seemed a very distant and clinical thought compared to the warmth inside her. After the speech, the floor was open to questions, which drew their attention away from each other. This was the part John was most interested in, after all, and Lizzie agreed with him that they were more likely to hear new information during that part. The first person to get the mic asked a boring generic question about what students could do in the face of giant companies. She also had a flirtatious walk, so Lizzie scowled at her for both reasons. Soon, though, Aaron was at the mic to ask his question. You covered the potential impact on the United States well, but only spoke in vague terms about the need for international regulations. What impact do you expect the rise of pharmaceutical giants to have on the global south? It was a question Lizzie hadn't really given much thought. She reflected that Aaron was always caring about impoverished and disadvantaged people. That was not a trait Lizzie shared. But looking at it objectively, she decided that it was a good form of kindness. She appreciated kindness in John, so she should give Aaron some credit as well. Outside of her mind, Francesca paused, but for only a moment before answering. Her response was smooth, but it lacked the practiced air for speech. Any large corporation is going to have a global impact, of course, and we'll see it especially in the rainforests and mineral-rich countries. Needless to say, those relationships will be exploitative. But I think we should be most suspicious of the actions that actually seemed most benevolent, specifically the ostensibly altruistic donations of drugs to various countries for free or produced at cost. For example, I have long believed that Zaz Inc. is distributing insufficiently tested drugs, and efficiently using the supposed beneficiaries of their donations as test subjects. But there can be serious concerns even for well-intentioned attempts, such as the mental stimulants Menninger AG donated in sub-Saharan Africa. They've had a positive impact on test scores, yes, but those drugs have serious long-term side effects when not taken according to a rigid schedule. Given the reality of the situation, both financial and personal, many recipients simply won't follow, or even have a chance to follow the proper course. We'll be seeing the consequences of that for years. A decent question, if not one that held particular interest for her. Lizzie listened to a few more bad questions before she sensed a general movement in John's body and realized that he was getting up to ask a question of his own. She nodded to him and let go of his hand. She listened in irritation as other people asked questions, but finally it was his turn. He cleared his throat nervously, but wasn't so uncomfortable as he might have been before. For those of us who want to have a career in this field, where do you think we can make the most difference? What balance do you see between regulating from the outside and trying to change organizations from within? Not a bad question, though Lizzie found herself wondering how much it mirrored his thought process. He discussed his thoughts about the future with her, of course, but there was something different about hearing him state them out loud in front of so many people. A good question, but a difficult one. I'd like to believe that the best answer is the FDCA or another regulatory body, but I'm not sure I'd recommend someone who hasn't started their career go that direction. We'll see what happens with our lobbying over the next few years. As for reforming from within, I'm tempted to say that it's impossible. Look at SoftSynth. It carried the Japanese economy for a time, but now internal conflict is threatening long-term deflation. In my mind, the biggest threat is that corporations will lack meaningful competition and make it effectively impossible for anyone to regulate them. So honestly, what we might need more than anything is business majors. I got a laugh from the audience, but it struck Lizzie as a serious answer. John pondered it as well, his eyes the cat stuck her tail in my face. Contemplative as he returned to sit beside her. Lizzie was dying to know his thoughts, but for now she just smiled as he sat down beside her. None of the questions after that were particularly notable. Lizzie began to get nervous as their time ran out, since if something bad were to happen, it would likely happen toward the end. Yet it ended without incident, as had every anxious situation in the years since the battle with Koitek operatives. But she was only slowly beginning to relax. If all those events had gone smoothly, maybe their wedding would as well. And if that was true, then what were they waiting for? Lizzie gazed toward John as they headed out, pondering the thought. But there were so many things they were dealing with, so many considerations, so many thoughts, and it was wonderful just being with him. There was no need to rush. Setting the matter aside, Lizzie happily just discussed the speech with John as they headed home. There would be discussion groups, but the only person she wanted in her group was him. They talked late into the night and happily fell asleep still in their clothes. In the middle of a boring psychology class, Lizzie partially listened to the lecture while she worked on her notebook. She was drawing lots of pictures of John now and getting a little better at it. Sometimes her focus drifted, though, and she found herself writing his name over and over again. Now that the event was past, most of her immediate fears had been put to rest, at least temporarily. If Koitek wasn't likely to be tracking them, then she had more options. Maybe they could get married after all. If so, she was disappointed that she made them wait so long. But how to get to that point? Though she didn't worry about making John afraid of her, she didn't want to add any stress to his life by seeming too insistent. And yet it had to be perfect. Their wedding would be another treasured memory of their lives together that she wanted to carry around with her forever. A small part of her did worry that he was putting it off for some reason of his own. She didn't doubt, couldn't doubt, that he was fully committed to her, but there was a difference between living together and actually getting married. The professor said something that drew some of her attention away from what really mattered. That list sounded like it would be on the exam, and he did like to include things that were lecture only to catch sleeping students. Lizzie quickly scribbled it down to memorize later, irritated at the distraction. The only reason she was even in the class was that she needed credit to graduate. At first, Lizzie had actually been interested, wondering if she could learn anything about depression that would help her to be a better partner to John. But mostly the class was just useless. Everything was focused on specific patterns of thought and declaring them to be unnatural when they didn't seem any stranger than any way most people thought. At least not to her. Trying to engage with it mentally just irritated her. And what they said about depression just made her angry. They talked about depression like it was a simple problem that would soon be cured. The professor was even a fan of Koitek. Lizzie was certain that if he had his way, they'd take away her John and replace him with a different person. Without realizing it, her writing in the notebook had become sketchy and angry. Lizzie refocused and tried to draw him again. The way he looked when he came through sadness and showed her that quiet happiness deep within his eyes. When the lecture ended, Lizzie wasn't quite there, so she bit her lip and tried to finish quickly. No one usually paid her any mind. She could finish and leave herself in a good place, but... holy shit! Lizzie reacted instantly at the voice over her shoulder, slamming her notebook closed with one hand and reaching down for her axe with the other. She restrained herself from acting, instead focusing up on the girl beside her. That is some serial killer shit right there. I don't think my personal drawings are any of your business. It's everybody's problem if you're stalking some random guy. Lizzie forced herself to smile, not mess up anything for him. Her body trembled just slightly as she put her notebook away and rose to her feet calmly. That isn't some random guy. It's my boyfriend. And does he know you keep a stalker journal? No, but that was beside the point. She didn't understand. She didn't understand at all. She was insulting their relationship. Lizzie evaluated her quickly. No physical threat. No capability to put up any resistance. Okay, that was the cat rubbing against the microphone. For a moment, her will coalesced and Lizzie was utterly certain that she needed to kill the girl. Her fingers twitched, preparing. Lizzie took a deep breath, trying to focus on her memories of John. It seemed so irrational to leave the girl alive, but she focused on him and pushed her way through. Barely. It took a supreme effort of will for Lizzie to hide her near outburst. The stupid girl hadn't noticed, but John would have, and answered calmly. I don't think it's your place to meddle with our relationship. Yeah, no. This is just like what we were talking about last week. Either he doesn't know and you're creepy as hell, or he does and you have some kind of weird codependent relationship. If you can't see you need help, you need someone to help you. That was the cat on the keyboard. You shouldn't say things like that. Look, I'm just applying what we look. John is a kind person. He wouldn't judge me like you do. then he's just enabling your condition. Lizzie took a deep breath and took a moment to think. It's really sad this is the first one I saw. Although I'm partial to this one. This one's pretty good. This one's a little too slow for my taste. This one's my level of thoroughness. Napalm's fairly easy to come across if you know what you're doing. This is a classic. And this is the basic option. Only your promise to him prevented Lizzie from doing what she wanted to do. Instead, she gave the other girl a smile. The professor also said that analysis should also be done by professionals. Are you a certified professional? Her response was nothing special, only the best that Lizzie could manage while under such stress. Yet the girl took a step back, suddenly uncertain. Look, I was just making an observation, okay? Perhaps you can make such observations about your own relationship. A moment later, the girl fled the class with remarkable speed. Lizzie suppressed her urge to give chase. That had not been entirely wise of her, but she didn't care about that right now. Her world was still hollow, and she slowly became aware that she was gripping the handle of her axe so tightly it hurt. Though her mind still knew exactly what it wanted to do, Lizzie remembered John and set those thoughts aside. Refocused, Lizzie carefully loosened her grip, then headed home at the highest speed that wouldn't draw attention. When she arrived, she threw herself into John's arms and held him tightly. He looked concerned, and she hesitated for a moment before the words spilled out of her in a white-hot flood. She held nothing back, telling the story in a disjointed tangle of the events, her emotions, and what she wanted to do. John just held her and listened, not judging in the slightest. Being in his arms always calmed her, and soon Lizzie was closer to what others would consider normal. She did like being this way, happy and peaceful, and she could do more for John like this. It was an unintended side effect, and it stopped her from slaughtering anyone. John, thank you. I'm always here for you, Lizzie. As she regained clarity, she realized that she had added stress to his life by doing this. Though she berated herself for it, Lizzie knew that he didn't mind helping her in this way. It doesn't make you angry to hear the things she said? It does a little, but she probably just has a big head after learning new concepts in class and wants to use them on people. John is kind. Too kind. I'll always protect him. And I'm glad you do, Lizzie. But you don't need to hurt anyone to protect me, okay? Okay. She embraced him warmly, trying to pour affection into him instead of just receiving it. Part of her regretted not holding back her thoughts, since it had drained him a little. But at least she knew that he would never judge her. She stayed in his arms for a while after that, setting aside her guilt over causing him stress, just indulging in his kindness for a while. The girl had been right about one thing. A normal boy could never have been with her. John was special. That was why they were so wonderful together. Even as she regained her full calm, however, one thing didn't change in her mind. Maybe it wasn't possible due to the circumstances, but it would have been better to kill the girl. After the incident, Lizzie spent a while sorting through her remaining thoughts. She had completely filled up one notebook, so she started a second and took it with her to boring classes. Math wasn't boring, but she did find herself running her fingers over the edge of the notebook as she worked. Later. For now, she would finish the requirement. Lizzie didn't mind math. It was straightforward, free of judgments. Though she didn't understand her professor's talk about its elegance and beauty, it didn't seem incomprehensible to her. He was all right for a non-John person. After class, she floated across campus to return home. That annoying couple tried to engage her in conversation again, but she was able to make polite small talk without committing to anything, and keep on her way without wasting too much time. Then she arrived home and found John looking at her notebook. Her focus condensed down to a single point flickering over everything. His posture, his eyes, the exact set of his mouth, the speed at which he looked up toward her. Once, such a thing would have been terrifying. It still made her scared that she might have gone too far this time, added doubt to his mind and ruined the relationship. And he did have a concerned look on his face. There would be no simple, easy solution. Lizzie, are these the things you felt you couldn't tell me? What? No, not at all. Okay, I do believe you. Have you been keeping notebooks like these as long as we've been together? She squirmed a little at that. Her desire to smooth things over and make him happy warring with her desire to be completely honest with him. I had books like these a long time ago, but no. I only started again recently. That's the only one, other than the new one I just started. Did something happen to make you more stressed? Is it something I've done? There was real pain in his eyes, and Lizzie hated herself for a brief moment. She caused him more pain, just as she'd sworn to herself that she would never do again. But her John never rushed to judgment, and he was strong, even if he was often sad, and she longed to protect him. Their relationship had been through more intense things. This wouldn't be the end. Lizzie carefully sat down opposite him. It definitely isn't anything you did, John, and it isn't anything specific. I've just been a little anxious lately. I was worried the speech might be more of a problem. I can understand that. He kept leafing through the notebook, leaving Lizzie to squirm uncomfortably. It represented her true thoughts, but some of them felt a little awkward under his gaze, and she couldn't tell what he was thinking. The fact ate her up inside until she couldn't hold it back anymore. You don't hate me, right? Nothing in the notebook scares you? John looked up at her in astonishment. A moment later, he moved forward to embrace her, and though that was wonderful, it was his honest surprise at her question that meant the most. She had just been paranoid. There was no need to fear. Oh, Lizzie, of course I couldn't hate you. I'm just sad that you were stressed and felt like you couldn't tell me. He wrapped an arm around her and pulled her so they sat side by side, then pulled the notebook into his lap. When I read these, I mostly just see you. This is who you are, and I can feel your love for me on every page. Turning the page to one of her drawings of Killing Smythe, his lips twitched in a bit of a smile. These are, I don't know, cute. I've seen you murder us, Lizzie, and this is different. Playful. If this helps you release your feelings, I think it's healthy. Oh, John, I should have known you would understand. I'm not perfect, but I'm always here, and I want to understand you. Which is why I have to ask, is it really nothing? Is there a reason you've been more stressed lately? Is it things like the girl in your psych class? Lizzie sighed and leaned against his chest, considering. It was a difficult question, not just because she had to think about what the best answer would be, but also because she wasn't entirely certain herself. In her mind, her thoughts all flowed together. Speaking with him made them feel clearer, but it wasn't always easy. I think one of these leads to an achievement, but I'm not sure which one. You mentioned the terrible girl from psych class, all the awful things she said about us. Lizzie flipped to the page after that event had occurred. Pages, actually. She'd forgotten how much she had written after that, though now it was crystal clear to her. After it happened, I felt everything. I hate her, John. I still wish I could get rid of her. But you won't, right? No. Writing it down, it captures what I'm feeling somehow. When I look it over again, I remember all the emotions, but there's some distance now. They're not as strong inside me. I think I get that. Maybe that's a healthy thing. Though I do worry that sometimes you get yourself more worked up writing out your thoughts. But it doesn't have to be writing, John. I get the same effect from talking to you, and it's better that way. Not just because I'm talking to you, but because you always have new thoughts and interesting things to say, and so sometimes I think about things differently. I'm glad to hear that. I'm always here to talk, Lizzie. I know, it's wonderful, but I don't have to share everything, do I? Sometimes what I'm thinking is just silly and it doesn't matter. I don't want to waste your time. He considered that very seriously, then pulled her a little closer with a smile. You can tell me anything at all, Lizzie, but don't feel obligated. Unless you don't have a working brain, everyone has tons of minor thoughts. They just pass through your mind. They don't matter unless you focus on them. I mean, I have a lot of dumb little thoughts, there's no point sharing. That's not true. I'd love to see every single thought you'd ever think. I believe you. But since that's not the world we live in, we can just talk to each other, okay? She eagerly nodded and pressed herself against him even closer. She was right to talk to him. John always had good things to say. But as warm as things were between them, Lizzie felt a bit of hesitance. When she looked at his face, she saw something shift and realized there was something less pleasant he wanted to bring up. Had something in the notebook upset him? Her heart began hammering in her chest. There is one thing we need to talk about, though. I mean this page, for example. Lizzie blinked in surprise as she scanned it quickly. It was a page of dense writing where she talked about him, largely about her love for him and many other things. What could be amiss there? Do you always write pronouns for me with a capital letter? Of course, John.
You're not like any other boy. You're the only person for me. I mean, I'm glad you love me, but I don't know about this. I'm not sure I'm comfortable with it. What? Why not? She stared at him, hiding the true dismay from her face. Inside, she was panicking. Usually John was so calm and steady. She loved understanding more about him. When she actually felt confused, it always terrified her, forced her to wonder if she was somehow drifting away from him forever. I know how intensely you feel things, but this just feels like a little much. I want you to be my partner, Lizzie. I don't want you to worship me. But John deserves it. You're wonderful and I love you with my whole heart. I know that. But since I love you too, I have to be honest with you. This worries me a little bit. This capitalized version of me, is that really me? I'm almost afraid all this is for someone else that represents me, but isn't me in truth. No, it isn't like that at all. She clutched him to her, his head against her chest while she gripped one hand in his hair. But through her dismay, she began to understand. The thought upset her a little, and the idea that she might be worshipping some false form of him was terrifying. But she could understand it. John was still her John. If I were to refer to you like any other boy, it just doesn't feel right. Like I'm saying they're the same as you, and I would never betray you like that, John. Lizzie, I think I can understand that a little, but can you understand me too? I do, John, I do. She stopped gripping him, though. Him so tightly, and let him pull back slightly. They stared into each other's eyes for a while and both smiled. Nothing that had been said changed their love for each other, and they both knew it. Lizzie leaned forward to kiss him gently. John was being too humble, but she wouldn't argue over that with him. She understood why he was upset, and she didn't mean to suggest anything like that. Certainly not to him, and now she needed to avoid suggesting it to herself. Maybe she could accomplish the same thing another way. It was only her fear that she was betraying him that made her think that way. If she had no fear, if she loved him even more utterly and totally than she ever had before, then it wouldn't matter if she capitalized the word or not. Though she wasn't there yet, Lizzie felt peaceful enough to quiet her thoughts and just enjoy kissing him for a while, and kissing him. When they finished, John pulled back and smiled gently at her. Well, this has been quite a conversation. If you want to take a break, I'd understand. But if you want to keep talking, I'm here for you. All I want is for you to hold me a little longer, okay? Of course. He held her just like that for a long time. Even afterward, when they got their textbooks and began reading, he stayed close, laying her rest against him so they were always touching. By the time they were ready to go to bed, Lizzie no longer felt nervous about him discovering her notebooks. But she also had a feeling that she wouldn't need them anymore.